At my cousin's engagement party, my parents laughed about my imaginary fiancé, so I toasted quietly and waited until he walked in smiling and saying, "Sorry I'm late, had to park the helicopter," unaware. We had just landed from Dubai. I'm 34, female born and raised in a traditional Indian American family based in Northern California. My upbringing was steeped in expectations. Go to college, preferably Stanford or Berkeley. Become a doctor, lawyer, or engineer. Marry young. Have 2 kids. Live within a 30-mile radius of your parents so they could babysit on weekends and inspect your spice rack. I derailed that script around age 21 when I chose to pursue design instead of medicine. That was strike 1. Strike 2 was when I dropped out of grad school after landing a job with a global marketing firm in Berlin. My parents, Robert and Susan, didn't take it well. Freelancing to them translated to unemployed. Remote consulting sounded like sitting on your laptop all day, wasting time. Every time we spoke, I felt like I had to justify my life choices, but the biggest strike, telling them I was engaged and that they couldn't meet him just yet. They had always been skeptical of my love life. I dated people from outside the community. I didn't introduce anyone unless I was serious. And when I met Blake, then a pilot and aeronautics consultant based between Sweden and Qatar, I waited almost a year before telling my family. When I finally did, my mother's first response was, "Why haven't we met him? Are you sure he's real?" It would have been funny if she hadn't actually believed I was lying. Fast forward to December of last year, my cousin Emily, 29, was getting engaged to Nathan, an Ivy League-educated cardiac surgeon who checked all the perfect Indian son-in-law boxes. The engagement party was held at a massive banquet hall in San Jose, no expense spared. It was a 3-day affair, catered buffets, choreographed dances, henna stations, even a sitar performance at brunch. I wasn't surprised when I got the invite. Just surprised when it included a snarky postscript from my mother. "Hope your fiancé can make it this time." Blake and I had already planned to be in the U.S. for a few weeks during the holidays. He had business meetings in Palo Alto, and we were visiting some of my friends down in L.A. We landed at SFO from Dubai 2 days before the event. He had to attend a last-minute meeting the afternoon of the engagement, but promised he'd meet me there by dinner. The catch: we were flying around via helicopter, borrowing a friend's aircraft for travel. Something that sounded over the top but was legitimately easier than dealing with Bay Area traffic and back-to-back events. I got to the venue alone, and from the moment I walked in, it started the whispers, the forced smiles, the questions I've come to expect from extended family. "Where's your fiancé, still in Doha? Have you thought about freezing your eggs? We just worry you're such a free spirit." I bit my tongue, smiled, took selfies with Emily, tried to focus on her on being a supportive cousin, but then near the bar I heard my mother laughing with her sister, Emily's mom, and a few aunties. I've stopped asking. She says he's in aviation. What does that even mean? Is he a flight attendant? She never shows photos, she added to Robert. Maybe he's imaginary. They all laughed. Not subtle. Chuckles big, open-mouthed. Can you believe this girl? Laughs? I was holding a glass of sparkling water, trying not to let my hand shake. I should have walked away. Instead, I stood there, letting it wash over me. There was nothing left to say to them, but deep down, I knew what was coming and they had no idea. After dinner, the planner came around with a microphone, asking guests to say a few words. Emily's friends spoke. Nathan's cousins said something sweet. Even my younger brother Jason, whom I hadn't spoken to in months, stood up to offer a few words about finding the one. Then, inevitably, the microphone was handed to me. I stood there, wine-colored silk sari, flowing hair pinned up minimal gold jewelry glinting under the chandeliers. A room full of faces stared back at me. Faces that had doubted, dismissed, and disbelieved me for years. I hadn't rehearsed anything, so I simply said, "I'll keep it short. It's beautiful watching 2 people who are supported, celebrated, and believed in. Not everyone gets that. If you do, hold on to it." There was a polite smattering of claps, and then it happened. A loud mechanical thrum, faint at first, then unmistakable. The unmistakable sound of helicopter rotors. Murmurs rippled across the room. Emily looked toward the window, confused. The planner rushed toward the entrance, and then Blake walked in. He wore a slim-fit navy blue suit, no tie. His watch caught the light under the chandeliers, his hair slightly wind-swept, gave him an effortlessly polished look that somehow made everyone else seem overdressed. "Sorry I'm late," he said, grinning. "Had to park the helicopter." Someone actually gasped. Blake walked straight toward me, ignoring the dozens of stunned eyes following him, and pressed a kiss gently to my forehead. "Did I miss your toast?" he asked softly. "No," I said, smiling up at him. "You're right on time." The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. I didn't even need to look around to feel it. The skepticism, the judgment, the fake smiles, they melted away into something else. Curiosity, attention, a recalibration. Blake politely introduced himself to the people standing nearby, Emily's mom, my aunt, who suddenly looked unsure of how to rearrange her face fast enough, and my mother, Susan, fidgeting nervously with the edge of her dupatta mouth slightly parted in disbelief. "Susan, Auntie, it's very nice to finally meet you," Blake said warmly, extending his hand. She hesitated just a beat too long before taking it. "Oh, yes, of course. Hello," she said in the exact stiff tone she reserved for neighbors she didn't like, but had to remain civil with Blake, then turned to my father Robert, who stood a few feet behind her, more composed but equally caught off guard. "Robert, uncle," Blake said, nodding. "I've heard so much about you." Robert gave him a firm handshake, masking his discomfort better than Susan, but I caught the flicker in his eyes, the tightness around his jaw, sizing Blake up, judging. "I understand you work in aviation," Robert said, trying to sound casual. "Yes," Blake replied easily. "Mostly consulting, now projects across Europe, the Gulf, and Asia, but I still fly occasionally. Keeps me grounded, ironically." A few people nearby chuckled, not because it was hilarious, but because the recalibration was happening fast. Suddenly, I wasn't the delusional daughter making up an imaginary fiancé. I was the mysterious cousin whose fiancé had just landed a helicopter outside a banquet hall. Still, it wasn't about the helicopter. Okay, maybe it was a little bit about the helicopter, but mostly it was about presence, about showing up. And Blake had done that in a way nobody could ignore, as he was pulled into conversations by my curious second cousins and uncles, who suddenly found his work fascinating. I stood there quietly watching the scene. It was surreal. I had spent years walking into rooms like this, bracing myself for judgment, and now I was the storm. My cousin Jason, still riding the smugness from his earlier speech, made his way toward me during dessert. "So," he said, gesturing toward Blake, who was now surrounded by a small crowd of intrigued relatives. "That's your guy." I looked at Jason, feeling tired but unwilling to let the moment slip by. "Yes," I said simply. "That's Blake." Jason let out a short laugh, still glancing over at Blake. "I honestly didn't think he was real." "Yeah," I said evenly. "A lot of people didn't." He paused for a moment, maybe to apologize, maybe to pivot into some kind of half-hearted compliment, but I didn't give him the chance. I turned and walked away, choosing this time to move toward someone who had never doubted me. Emily. When I reached her, she squeezed my hand, her face radiant from the evening's celebrations. "Best moment of the night," she whispered, grinning. "I wasn't trying to upstage you," I said earnestly. "You didn't," she said without hesitation. "You just reclaimed your place, and it was about damn time." Her words hit me harder than I expected, not because they were dramatic or sentimental, but because they were true. I had spent so long being cautious, trying not to disturb the delicate balance of family expectations, even when those expectations didn't fit me. Tonight, without planning it, without forcing it, I had stepped fully into my own life in front of all of them. Later that evening, near the staircase leading down to the valet area, my mother found me. Susan looked unsettled, curious, but also a little unsure of herself. "Why didn't you tell us he was coming?" she asked. I shrugged, arms crossed loosely over my sari. "Would it have changed anything?" She hesitated. I could see the flicker of emotions crossing her face. Pride, confusion, regret, stubbornness, all battling for control. She faltered. "I didn't realize." "What didn't you realize?" I asked quietly. Susan looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at me. "I didn't realize he was this serious." And there it was, the weight of years of conversations we never had, the countless times I tried to explain my choices and was met with skepticism or dismissal. the way they made me feel like I was living adulthood incorrectly simply because I hadn't followed their script. But for the first time, she was trying. Clumsily, awkwardly, but trying. "I'm glad you came," she added after a long pause. "Me too," I said, and I meant it. Not for them, for me. A little while later, Blake found me out on the rooftop garden attached to the venue. It was quieter up there, away from the chandeliers and the endless buffet lines. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin lightly on my shoulder. "How'd it go?" he murmured. I smiled, watching the Bay Area skyline glitter in the distance. "Better than I expected," I said. "Worse than it should have had to be." He didn't say anything for a moment. "They'll catch up," he said finally. "I'm not waiting," I replied. "I know," Blake said, pulling me a little closer. We stood there for a long time, the music below us shifting to something slower and softer. Conversations from the party floating into the night air like smoke. I didn't know what would happen next with my family, whether tonight had truly changed anything, but I knew this. For once, they had seen me, and more importantly, I had seen myself. Blake and I stayed up on that rooftop until almost everyone had gone. The stars were faint above the Bay Area haze, but the air had cleared. Below us, the party was thinning into that awkward stretch of time where aunties started packing Tupperware and uncles lingered over half-empty whiskey tumblers, neither quite ready to leave, but not adding anything to the conversation either. We watched it all from above, like spectators at a play we no longer needed to perform in. Eventually, we went back downstairs to say goodbye to Emily and Nathan. They were on the dance floor again, slightly tipsy, glowing with the kind of ease you have when you know you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I hugged Emily tightly. "You did great," I told her. "So did you," she replied, grinning. "You have no idea how satisfying that was for me." We both laughed, and Nathan offered Blake a casual fist bump, which Blake returned with that calm, unbothered confidence he always carried. As we made our way to the valet line, I could feel my parents' eyes on us from across the room. They didn't say much during our exit. Robert gave a polite nod. Susan offered Blake a thin-lipped smile that almost passed for warmth. It was fine. I wasn't expecting miracles. I wasn't expecting them to change overnight. But something had shifted. Maybe not dramatically, but tectonically. When we got back to the hotel, I peeled off my sari, wiped the kajal from my eyes, and collapsed backward onto the bed with a theatrical groan. "That bad?" Blake asked already, halfway out of his suit, his tie tossed onto the couch. "Not bad," I said, staring up at the ceiling. "Just heavy." You ever walk into a room where everyone's pretending you're invisible, and then suddenly they're trying to memorize your resume? I asked, half laughing. Blake chuckled, unbuttoning his cuffs. "Yeah," he said. "Most rooms, actually." I laughed too, because that was part of why we worked. He understood things I never had to explain twice. After a moment, he asked, "Do you regret it?" "What, tonight? Coming?" I sat up slightly, resting on my elbows. "No," I said, shaking my head. "Not even for a second." Because the truth was, even with all the tension, all the passive-aggressive comments, all the years of being sidelined and misunderstood, this moment, this subtle but undeniable shift was something I had needed. Not to validate my life, not to prove my relationship, but to confront what had been hanging over me for years. Blake lay down beside me, one arm tucked behind his head. "You didn't need me to prove anything," he said quietly. "You already did." "Maybe," I said, but still it helped. The next few days were strange. There was no explosive fallout, no big confrontations, no sudden invitations for dinner or tearful apologies. But little things started happening. Small things. My father forwarded me an article from Forbes about a real estate project, writing, "Reminds me of one of the projects you mentioned. Interesting read." My mother posted a picture in the family group chat, a candid shot of Blake and me standing near the stage, smiling. The caption read, "Look who finally made it into the family album." It was the first time she'd publicly acknowledged him. My aunt, the one who had laughed the loudest at the imaginary fiancé joke, sent me a Facebook friend request and liked 3 of my old travel photos from Jordan and Croatia. Even Jason texted Jason, "Hey, sorry if I've been a JRK. Me, not sure if that's an apology or a TED Talk intro. Jason, let's go with both." I didn't respond immediately, but I saw it for what it was, an olive branch wrapped, of course, in typical older brother sarcasm. It wasn't everything, but it was something. One afternoon, back in San Mateo, I stopped by my childhood home to pick up a few items my mother had asked me to collect. Some jewelry from an old box, a shawl that had belonged to my grandmother, a pressure cooker she insisted was too premium to ship overseas. Blake stayed in the car scrolling through his phone while I went inside. The house looked the same. It still smelled of incense and coriander. The familiar framed family portraits lined the hallway, but something caught my eye. A newer frame. Inserted among the photos of Emily and Nathan of Jason at graduation, it was a picture from the engagement party. A candid shot of me and Blake standing near the stage, smiling. I stopped, really looked at it. "Did you print this?" I asked as my mother Susan came into the hallway. She glanced at the photo, then at me. "Emily emailed it," she said, adjusting a vase that didn't need adjusting. "I liked it. It's a nice picture." There was a long silence. I could feel the weight of everything unsaid stretching between us. Finally, she said quietly, "I may have misjudged." I turned to look at her, fully waiting. "He seems thoughtful," she added, voice softer than I remembered ever hearing from her when it came to my choices. I wasn't sure how to respond. It wasn't an apology. Not really, but it was the closest we had ever gotten. "I never needed you to be impressed," I said evenly. "I just needed you to stop assuming I was lying." Susan didn't argue. For once, she nodded slightly. "You've always done things differently," she said. "That's hard for us to understand, but maybe different doesn't mean wrong." It wasn't a perfect moment, not a neat resolution. But it was a crack, a small crack in the thick wall that had stood between us for so long. I took the box she handed me, hugged her briefly carefully, then left before either of us could ruin it by saying too much. When I got back to the car, Blake looked up from his phone. "You okay?" he asked. Scanning my face, I nodded. "Yeah." He didn't push for more. That's another reason I loved him. He understood that sometimes silence was the loudest kind of peace. We flew back to Dubai a few days later. The trip had drained me emotionally in ways I hadn't even fully processed until we landed back on our own turf. The warm, dry air hit my face as we exited the airport. The familiar hum of Arabic and English blending in the background soothed something raw inside me. Dubai was noisy, alive, unapologetically bold. So unlike the quiet, tiptoeing version of myself I often became in my parents' world. Blake and I didn't talk much about the engagement party after that. We didn't need to. The trip had done what it needed to do. We slipped back into our rhythm. Late dinners on the balcony, weekends at the marina, flights to meetings in Riyadh or Paris. We were back to us. But something lingered. Not bitterness, not even a need for approval anymore. It was a different kind of itch, the itch of unfinished business. Because back in California, my parents had started making small gestures toward acknowledging my life, but they had never truly understood what I had built or what it had cost me. For years, they mocked and doubted, confident in the superiority of their path. They didn't think I was capable of making something real, of making something mine. And now, I didn't want just polite nods or group chat photos. I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to watch me win loudly and undeniably. That's where the idea came from. A few months after we returned, Blake and I were both invited to speak at a high-profile business summit in Dubai. He was giving a keynote on aviation logistics in emerging markets. I was being honored for my branding consultancy, which had just hit a 7-figure milestone after signing a major contract with a luxury conglomerate. They asked if I would give a talk about building personal brands across cultures and scaling businesses without VC funding. I agreed, but with one condition, that I could invite guests. They said yes. I sent 2 priority invitations to Robert and Susan along with a handwritten note. "You once asked if I was serious about my life. I'd like to show you what serious looks like." They didn't reply for 3 days, then finally a text from my mother, "We'll be there." When they arrived in Dubai, Blake picked them up from the airport in our Tesla, not the helicopter. We'd already done that show once. He took them to our home. A sleek 3-bedroom apartment overlooking the Palm with floor-to-ceiling windows and an open kitchen. I watched their faces carefully. My mother's eyes darted around, taking in the modern lighting, the Moroccan tile work, the subtle luxury of a life they hadn't pictured for me. My father tried to stay composed, but I saw the surprise flicker across his face. They had expected what? A bohemian expat life. Mismatched furniture and leftover student debt. They hadn't expected this. They hadn't expected me. That night at the summit, I stood on stage in a white tailored pantsuit, hair pulled back, poised and unapologetic. I told my story. Not about the family drama, at least not directly. I talked about rejection, about resilience, about being underestimated, about having the audacity to believe my work mattered even when no one else did. I talked about building my own table when none had a seat for me, and my parents were sitting in the front row. Susan had tears in her eyes. Robert clapped a beat longer than everyone else. After the talk, entrepreneurs and executives came up to congratulate me. People from industries I once thought I'd never even enter, even minor royalty. Robert stood nearby, shaking hands like he was at one of his own business conferences, pride mixing awkwardly with disbelief. That night at dinner, my mother turned to Blake and said quietly, "Thank you for standing beside her, for believing in her when we didn't." Blake smiled politely but didn't say, "You're welcome," because by then it wasn't about them anymore. Before they flew back to California, my father pulled me aside. We stood together on the balcony of our apartment, the skyline of Dubai stretching out beyond us, glittering against the night sky. The air was warm and dry, carrying the hum of a city that never really slept. Robert shifted uncomfortably as if searching for the right words. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence between us was heavy. Not angry, not resentful, just full of all the things we had never said out loud. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You've done well," he said, his voice quieter than I ever remembered hearing it. "I didn't see it before, but you've built something." I turned to look at him, studying his face in the low light. There were new lines around his eyes, a tightness to his mouth that hadn't been there when I left home so many years ago. He looked older, more human. This was the man who once told me that design wasn't a real career, who had begged me to go back to graduate school, who had warned me I would end up alone, struggling, invisible. The man who saw success only through the narrow lens of prestige and tradition. And now he was standing here admitting he had been wrong. "I know." I said simply, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I didn't soften it with a joke or wave it away with false modesty. I let the moment stand, let it stretch between us. He nodded slowly. Then, after a long beat, he added, "I'm proud of you." It was strange. Hearing those words I had spent most of my young life quietly yearning for, didn't hit me the way I once imagined they would. They didn't feel like a triumph or a relief or a victory. They felt like a punctuation mark, not the beginning of anything, not even really an ending, just a small, soft acknowledgement that I had never actually needed, because by now I wasn't doing this for them. I hadn't built my life to prove a point. I had built it because I refused to let their limited vision of me become the blueprint for my existence. And in doing so, I had created something so much bigger, so much richer than anything they had ever dared to imagine for me. I smiled, a real easy smile. "Thank you," I said, and I meant it, not because I needed his approval, but because he finally saw me, not the daughter who had failed to follow the script, but the woman who had written her own. We stood there a little longer, the city stretching out before us. Neither of us rushing to end the conversation, but neither trying to stretch it beyond its natural end. Eventually, he patted my shoulder awkwardly and turned back inside. I stayed out on the balcony for a while after he left, breathing in the night air, letting it fill my lungs, and I realized this was the best kind of revenge. It wasn't about the helicopter or the summit speech or the luxurious apartment overlooking the sea. It wasn't about the business class tickets or the contract with a billion-dollar company. It wasn't about any singular dramatic moment. It was about the quiet, relentless truth that I had grown into the person they never thought I could become, and I didn't need their validation to know it, but letting them see it, letting them sit in the front row and witness it with their own eyes. That was satisfying, so deeply, deliciously satisfying, because the real victory wasn't about proving them wrong. It was about proving myself right. It was about living so fully, so unapologetically, that their doubts became irrelevant. Shrinking in the face of what I had built with my own 2 hands, I didn't need their permission, I didn't need their pride. But still hearing "I'm proud of you" after all these years, hearing it when I no longer needed it, when I had already made peace with myself, that was the sweetest kind of justice. Not revenge, soaked in anger, but revenge rooted in growth, in joy, in undeniable success. And as I stood there, the Dubai skyline glittering around me, I smiled to myself again. They had finally seen me, but more importantly, I had never stopped seeing myself.